As you may remember from last week, we kind of took some time in looking at Genesis 22 and really looking at the question of what do you do when you know God's commands but you don't understand the purpose? What's the right response when you have learned a command from God, or like Abraham had heard the command from God and it just doesn't make sense? And yet to understand, Abraham showed it to us. You humbly obey even if you don't understand everything about it. And to the point where Abraham's faith responded to know God will keep his promise. His promise is that Isaac, it'll be through him that my descendants are going to come. My descendants are going to be as many as the stars and as many as the grains of sand on the seashore. And so whenever they're traveling to Moriah, which is actually in the same place as Jerusalem, he knows, I'm going to go offer him up as a burnt offering, and by faith he recognizes, and God is going to turn that ash back into my son, because I know he made me a promise. And to realize there were no resurrection stories in the book of Genesis before him coming to this idea, and it's not even really exposed in Genesis as much as we saw last week in Hebrews chapter 11. If you would, open up to 2 Chronicles chapter 3. I mentioned this really quick last week, but I want to make sure that you see these things together. 2 Chronicles chapter 3. And in 2 Chronicles, it's in the lineage of David. You've come to the times of Solomon. And Solomon's about to build the house of the Lord. And I want you to notice specifically the place. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. It says, Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began to build on the second day in the second month on the 4th year of his reign. And so, you take real quick note to understand, this is the place that God had desired and that God had commanded for the temple to be built. And to notice that the temple in Jerusalem is built on the same place as Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah, of course, is mentioned by name in Genesis 22 as being exactly where they are whenever Isaac is going to be offered up. And to realize how many parallels there are in that offering in Genesis 22 with here's Jesus that's going to be offered up. Specifically for us as a sin offering, of course, Isaac's being offered up as a burnt offering, saying to God from Abraham, God, I give you all of me, and even my son in whom there's promises. And realize he's faithful to that. And of course, it also adds on here in 2 Chronicles 3:1 about it's also the same location where, if you remember, whenever David took a census, that there was an offering that was supposed to be made to God, and David neglected to make that offering. And so there was a major plague that came through Jerusalem because of it. And David even got to make a choice for those 3 days. And then David responds to make a statement along the lines of, I'm the one who's the problem. Why do these people have to suffer for me? And that's when God responds to tell him, go to the threshing floor of Ornan, also known as Araunah, and he gets to go out and see Araunah. And Araunah, if you go back and read the story, when David comes out, Araunah says, anything that you need, O king, I'll give it to you. If you want my oxen to make an offering, if you want my threshing sledges, it's like saying my equipment that I use all the time, he says, you can use to burn it and to make an altar, and I will give you everything. If you remember, David makes the statement, how can I offer to God something that costs me nothing? And he's told to offer up a burnt offering, as well as some others, and to go, this is a very special geographical place in terms of where God said to Abraham, I will show you the place. And there's a specific reason why. Here's God looking years in advance, hundreds of years, even thousands of years, with looking forward to the times of Solomon and to what we know of in the times of Jesus, for Jesus to be there. So just kind of understand, whenever you hear those 3 stories, know that they take place on the same plot of ground. Then, come back to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. Look at verse 19. It says, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. And if you remember, Beersheba is the place where Abraham had made this agreement with Abimelech of saying, this is going to be my well. They had 7 sheep for the offering. Sheba is the Hebrew word for 7. Beer, B-E-R, is the Hebrew word for well, as you might imagine. And he says, and that's where Abraham lived. And so then he's going to click into something a little bit different here for the rest of the chapter, and we're not going to spend much time on it. But in verses 20 through 24, he's going to describe the lineage of not Abraham, but he's going to go to Abraham's brother by the name of Nahor. If you remember, Terah had 3 sons, and we read about this in Genesis 11. Terah's 3 sons are Haran and Nahor and Abraham. And of course, they have a half-sister by the name of Sarah, or Sarai, depending on what point in Genesis you're at. Here they are, and now he's going to start to describe this, and there's a very specific reason why, and we're just going to kind of let it lay down, and we'll pick it up when we get over to chapter 24 later. Verse 20, it says, now it came about after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, I don't know who told him this, it just says that he's told. He says, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Now, Nahor's brother is Haran, and Haran's daughter's name is Milcah, or Milcah, however you would like to say that. And so whenever you start to think about a niece marrying her uncle, I know for us that's cringeworthy, but yet for them, you see that's part of what's in place. And so Milcah has borne children to her brother Nahor. You're going to find out here pretty quick. There's 8 sons that she's going to bear. In other words, boy, multiply and fill the earth. They are taking that to heart. Verse 21, and if you're ever going to have male sons and twins, I think this would just be funny, but you go right ahead with what you know is right. Verse 21, Uz his firstborn and Buz his brother. Now, wouldn't you love to see twin boys named Uz and Buz? Now, these guys aren't twins, but I just feel like with an Uz and a Buz, these boys are going to be pretty rambunctious. That just seems like to me. Doesn't say that. It says Uz his firstborn and Buz his brother. You may think about the name Uz if you remember reading the very beginnings of the book of Job. Job is from the land of Uz. So understand, there's a tie in there somehow. How exactly that works out, we won't chase that today. Uz his firstborn and Buz his brother, and Kemuel, the father of Aram. Now, don't count Aram as one of these 8 brothers. He's just telling you Aram's coming along as a descendant of Kemuel. Verse 22, and Chesed and Hazo and Pildash and Jidlaph and Bethuel. Pildash just sounds like something you'd give a kid to make him run faster, but I don't know. These names are just curious to me. Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. The whole reason that we're here is for Bethuel. That's why it gives this whole amount of information. Because of the very next verse, verse 23. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Now, Rebekah has a brother by the name of Laban. And of course, later on, when we get to chapter 24, Isaac is going to marry Rebekah. So it's giving you this information now, kind of chronologically, so that whenever we get over to chapter 24, you go, oh, where did Rebekah come from? It says, well, let me show you the lineage back, and you can turn back to it then. It says, Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah born to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Verse 24, his concubine, whose name was Ramah, also bore Teba and Gaham and Tahash and Maacah. And so it just kind of puts a bow on this and leaves it there for now. And then you come to chapter 23, and another major event is going to take place. Here, look at verse 1. It says, now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So when you start to kind of think through this, Sarah's 127 years old, and so you already know some of these things in particular. How old is Abraham if she's 127? 137. Abraham's 10 years older. How old is Isaac? 37. Because remember, she's 90 whenever Isaac is born, so he's 37 years old, so he's not a young lad anymore. He's much older than he was back in chapter 22. So you see what's at hand here. You're getting kind of this picture of as time passes. And I just want to give you a general thought, because I know we've been in the life of Abraham ever since we got to Genesis chapter 11. You also need to understand Isaac is the 11th generation after Shem, of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is still alive with Isaac at this age of being 37. Now, that doesn't mean not every generation from Shem all the way down to Isaac are alive. There's only 4 generations that are alive in this mix in terms of who were given in the lineage back in Genesis chapter 11. But just realize, can you imagine for them in their time, even at this point in time, that Isaac could actually, if he chose to go search out Shem, could ask him what the world was like before the flood and get an eyewitness answer? Can you fathom that? To go, all these years have passed, and to still have eyewitnesses of the world before the flood, and to have an eyewitness of someone who spent that 365 days on the ark, and to see someone who had seen the world the way it was. And you just imagine for them, if you had that conversation with Shem now, and you say, boy, things are getting really bad, what would he tell you? You just don't know. You don't know. Let me tell you about it. There's a reason God destroyed all of the old world in terms of by means of the flood. So I just kind of want you to understand the time and place we're talking about, because we've really been in Abraham's life for over 11 chapters now. And sometimes we think, well, those things that were earlier on are all way gone. Just understand, Shem is still walking the earth. And by the way, Shem is going to outlive Abraham. Abraham's going to die before Shem will. Doesn't that sound like something? I'll let you do your own math. You'll see it real easily when you try. Then, Genesis 23, back to verse 1. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Verse 2. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. First of all, let's kind of deal with the place. Hebron, let me make sure I tell you the right thing here before I mess it up. Hebron is 26.7 miles from Beersheba. If you remember, Beersheba is where Abraham went after offering up Isaac on Mount Moriah, of course, with the stand-in with the ram. Then, so here he is, over 26 miles from home. Whenever they're there and Sarah dies, he says, in the land of Canaan, and of course, Canaan, is one of the descendants of Ham, way back there from the ark. And they've called the land Canaan. We've gotten further along, you'll see. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. What does this tell you about their relationship? They're really close. Now, the first time we get an age on Abraham, he's 75 years old, which means how old was Sarah? 65. And if you start counting up the years, from the first time we have an age to the time present of whenever Sarah dies is 62 years. Now, realize this, it doesn't tell you what year they got married. But even if she was 27, they would have been married for 100 years. If she's 37, they'd be married for 90. If she's 47, they'd be married for 80. I mean, I think about how amazing it is when somebody's married for 70 or even 75. And yet to go, what kind of closeness is there among the two of them? And you think all the different things that they've been through together, just in the stories that we've seen. And so when you start and think back through this, for some of you, I know you can identify with this far better than others in losing a mate and going, you remember so many things that you do together, and you realize you're not going to have those times again. And if you notice at this point, Abraham's not going. There's a promise here that she's going to return or anything along those lines. So don't try and go down that road. But here's the other aspect of this. I want you to think about Sarah for a minute. What we've seen through even the New Testament talking about things and what we have here in Genesis, let's kind of take a moment and kind of attend the funeral of Sarah. There's not a funeral mentioned here, but just thinking about, she's weeping and mourning. I mean, he's weeping and mourning over her. And you think, I don't know, maybe it's just the present day situation of tough guy mentality. Yet, for this to be written down that he's actually weeping over her in all this. And he's mourning this loss with her. And to think of these events together, you can think of events where Sarah does some pretty rotten things. I mean, how she treats Hagar. Kindness? No. She wants to get rid of him. Does she go along with the plan to deceive the king of Pharaoh and Abimelech? Yeah. And you think, man, there's some really difficult times in there and bad choices. And yet to think, when we pass away from this earth, there'll be some bad things that we did, and we go, should have done it different. I wish I'd have grasped it sooner. But yet, I want you to look at the New Testament real quickly. Look over at Hebrews chapter 11. I know we've read some of these things before, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11. Hebrews 11:11. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. And you think, roughly, she was 89 years old whenever she conceived, and 90 whenever Isaac is born. But notice, we know who gave her the ability. But what did it take to have this happen? Faith. And you can probably remember the times, if you have children, whether you were the mother or the father, of those times where the child is in the womb, and there's just some special memories that get made. Can you imagine for Abraham being able to remember those kind of things about, man, I remember when she was 89 years old, and here we were expecting. And here's this nice, lovely little bump on the belly and going, look at what's coming. The promises of God are coming. And when those times come, you think back on those great memories, don't you? When you lose someone. And yet to go, here she is. And every time that Sarah's brought up in the New Testament, it's always a positive memory. There's not one negative thing said about Sarah in the New Testament. And Sarai never shows up in the New Testament, just in case you're wondering. So you see how she's made to be remembered in the New Testament. Take a look at another. Look over at 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. Something else that Abraham would have remembered about Sarah after she died. Look at verse 3. Of course, the context in 1 Peter 3 is about a godly wife under the new covenant. But here in verse 3, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses. What is this holy behavior not really about? It's not about the outward. Now, you can take that in the wrong way. Holy behavior, holy attire. But looking at this and going, it can't just be external, not merely. Verse 4. But let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. And what's so unique is this Greek word for hidden is literally about pathways that were under the city of Jerusalem. We would think of like an aqueduct underneath that you don't see, but look at what it does. And that's the way this godly wife is talked about. He says it has to be the hidden person of the heart. It's not just limited to what you say, it's about what's going on the inside. Then it says the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit. And notice, how does God see a gentle and quiet spirit? It is precious. Typically things that are precious, are they rare or very easy to find? Typically rare. Same thing here. Verse 5. For in this way, in former times, and you talk about going back 2,000 years, he says, for in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. And you realize, here's the same thing about holy behavior, which of course 1 Peter is all about. Then to make the statement here, who hoped in God. This is the big difference, isn't it? If a holy woman is going to hope in God, what kind of spirit is she going to have? Quiet, gentle. Think about it in terms of hidden person of the heart. He says, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. And notice the illustration, verse 6. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. He says, and don't be afraid to be holy, wives. Don't be intimidated by looking around and think about, well, what will people say if I'm really gentle and quiet? They'll run over the top of me. Don't do it with fear. Here's what's something to me. When you think about Abraham weeping and mourning over Sarah, it is a different kind of weeping and mourning when you know you have lost a holy wife. One who is there, who is not looking to ramrod you, but is looking to be submissive and holy, quiet and gentle spirit. And to see these things together, I think we can understand why Abraham is weeping and mourning the way he is over Sarah. Even though we can think in Genesis, there's faults here. Yes. Yet, in the end, how is she remembered? Very highly, being holy. He says, this is the type of behavior. So come back to Genesis chapter 23. So when you see here in verse 2, and it talks about Sarah's death, that it takes place in Hebron, which is 26.7 miles away from Beersheba, down south. He says, in the land of Canaan, these are the descendants of Ham. Then to go on a little bit further, he says, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And he does that. And those kind of things still happen today. That is not something new. Then, whenever we lose our mates. Verse 3. Then Abraham rose from before his dead. It's kind of an interesting way to put it, isn't it? He says, and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, the sons of Heth are descendants of Canaan. They are also going to be, you're going to see the descendants of the Amorites are going to be part of the promise that God made to Abraham, saying you're going to have the peoples of this land. One of the peoples that he mentioned specifically is an Amorite by the name of Makah. We'll deal with that here in a little bit. So here it is. He spoke to the sons of Heth, and to realize Abraham's already been given a promise. This land is to you and your descendants, specifically through Isaac. With all these things together, he's already going to inherit all the land. But here he is after the death of Sarah, and he has a conversation. He speaks to the sons of Heth, saying, verse 4, I'm a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you that I may bury my dead out of my sight. He says, I don't want her to be buried close to where I live. People mourn different, don't they? It's not always the exact same. Some people want things to be very close so they never forget. Some people want things to be far off so they don't just completely drown in the mourning aspect. And there's not one right way to do it other than trusting in the Lord. But you notice Abraham says, will you give me a burial site here in Hebron? This is your land, those are the sons of Heth. And he says, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Verse 5. Here's the response that he gets from the sons of Heth. You're going to see this conversation go back and forth. Verse 5. The sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, hear us, my Lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you his grave for burying your dead. What kind of reception does he get from the sons of Heth? Is he a man who's honored? Yes. Even though he's really not in his own hometown, right? I mean, he's over 26 miles away from home, and they're saying, you're a great prince, you're among us. He says, basically, you just tell us where you want her to be buried, and we will gladly supply that. What is God showing Abraham through this? Favor. To think about, here's a man who's mourning over his beloved wife, and what does God do? Let me show you grace. And they're saying, wherever you want her to be buried, it's almost like just say the word. And if you notice the next aspect of what's here, he says, He says, nor refuse for his grave for burying your dead. And he says, and we don't care if you even pick the very best spots, the choicest of them all. You know, it's one thing whenever you pull up with a load of fruit and you say, hey, you know, you can have some. And you go, oh, well, not that one. But to look at this, and they are so free toward Abraham to say, you pick even the best, choicest places, and we'll give it to you. And you might look at that and go, is this some leader talking for everybody else, and everybody else going, oh, I hope he doesn't pick my place. Notice how it continues. Here, look at Abraham's response, verse 7. He sees what's going on. So Abraham rose and bowed to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. What does he show to them? Respect. He doesn't say, well, it's about time you showed me some honor around here. He bows to them. Now, don't see this as worship. Just see it as respect. Respectful of the people of the land, the same land that he's been promised by God to inherit all of. You know, you can almost hear it, I'm entitled to this by God. You should just give it to me. Is that the way he appeals? He says, will you give me a place to bury the dead? And they say, we'll give you the choicest of all places. You just tell us where. And Abraham responds out of respect, not out of entitlement. Then, verse 8, and Abraham spoke with them, saying, if it is your wish for me to bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and approach Ephron the son of Zohar for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns, which is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence for a burial site. If you really want to do this, isn't it interesting that he calls the place by name, and he knows who owns it? And specifically notice, what does he ask for specifically? He says, just give me the cave. And he even says, you don't really have to give it to me. I'll pay you full price. I don't even want a discount. Now, how many of us think that way when we go to buy something? Well, don't give me a discount, whatever you do. That's not the way we like to go, is it? Here he is, once again, look at the promises that Abraham has been given about this land. And yet he's saying, I'll pay the full price. Notice once again, look at the grace of God. In all of this, he brings it together, and look at who's present. Ephron himself. As part of this group that's standing there on behalf of the sons of Heth, all of a sudden he asks specifically, how about the cave of Machpelah? He says, which Ephron owns, who's also the son of Zohar. He says, and just at the end of his field, there's a cave. Could I just have the cave? I'll pay full price for it. And then look at what Ephron does. Verse 10. Now Ephron was sitting among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite. Now, it gives you that little identifier, Ephron the Hittite. I'm going to show it to you. Look back at Genesis chapter 15. I've already mentioned it, but I just want you to see it. Genesis chapter 15. Look down at verse 18. Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord, covenant God, made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt, which we refer to as the Nile River, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite, specifically the Hittite. He says, and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite, we've run into some of them. He says, and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. By the way, those of Jebus lived in the city of Jerusalem, just to give you a little heads up there. So notice specifically, this is part of the covenant. So Abraham already knows very specifically that these lands are going to be his. Where these peoples live is going to be the descendants I say his. They're going to be given to his descendants. So come back over here to Genesis 23. So whenever you get to verse 10, it says, now Ephron was sitting among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite, ding, 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 answered Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Heth. In other words, this conversation is not just a private conversation. This is a public conversation. I almost think in terms of, it almost sounds like a town meeting with Abraham, is the way it kind of comes off to me. He says, even of all who went in at the gate of his city, saying, verse 11, no, my Lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the presence of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. What does Ephron offer? He says, I'll give you the field as well as the cave. What do you see God doing here? You respond out of faith, even in times of loss, what will you find? The faithfulness of God. You'll find His grace. And you see these situations come together, and He says, I'll give it to you. Then, once again, verse 12, this sounds like a little bit of a repeat. And Abraham bowed before the people of the land. What does he do again? Respect. He shows them respect. I mean, this has all been promised to him. Verse 13. Abraham spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people. They get to hear all this. Hearing of the people of the land, saying, if you will only please listen to me, I will give the price of the field, accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. He says, please let me pay. This kind of sounds like two people who are showing agape love in terms of wanting self-sacrifice and trying to figure out who's going to pay for dinner. Right? I want to give it to you. I want to do this. I want to give you the field. And Abraham's saying, I want to pay full price. Just let me pay for it. And you kind of see him going back and forth and going, what a wonderful problem to have. Right? Then, verse 14. Then Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, my Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver, what is that between me and you? So bury your dead. And it's as if Ephron says, I don't care about the money. I don't care about it. What is a piece of land worth 400 shekels between us? Sometimes you have those kind of conversations with people too, don't you? It's probably not 400 shekels of silver. But you go, it's okay, I don't need money for this. I don't want it. Somebody says, but I want it. I don't want to do this to you. And you realize, here they are. And understand this together too. He says, what is that between me and you? He says, so bury your dead. It's already there for you. Now, notice this conversation happens between Sarah's death and Sarah's burial. And sometimes those can be very stressful times, can't they? Between when the loved one passes away and when the actual burial takes place. And then to be met with two people who want to humble themselves and look out for the betterment of the other. I tell you what, funeral homes long for families that are like that and situations that are like that. Now, look at what else happens. Verse 16. Abraham listened to Ephron. And Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, commercial standard. Now, don't you appreciate that it says, and it was up to standard. This was not like, it was kind of there. 400 shekels of silver probably doesn't mean a whole lot to us. When you think in terms of shekels, it's about a weight. If you do the math, it works out to about 10 pounds worth of silver, or as you might want to think, 160 ounces of silver. And on the present market today, silver sells for 34.37 cents an ounce. If you looked at one point today, it changes, of course. And so if you do the math, you come up with a number of like $5,500, which sounds like a pretty significant amount. But at the same time, finding conversions that way are really not the best way to find a good feel of it, because you can find other places that go back to the same time. They'll talk about how that, you might only make 24 shekels of silver a year as an unskilled laborer. So just kind of take that with a grain of salt. But understand the amount of money that's changing hands here is not something that's insignificant. This is not like, I'll give you 20 bucks. So you see what Abraham's doing, and he wants to make sure that Ephron's taken care of. So he pays this, and he does it up to the commercial standard. Notice there is no slack in Abraham. He's going to do it above the bar, is probably what we would say, which is another sign of what? Faith. Faith even in the passing of a loved one. You see him still responding to God to do it in a way that is so far above what is normally expected. Then, verse 17. So Ephron's field, which is in Machpelah, which faced Mamre, the field and cave which was in it, and all the trees which were in the field that were within all the confines of its borders were deeded over. Isn't that something? Here we are some more than 2,000 years before Jesus, and what are they already doing with land? Deeds. Man. And you thought dealing with a title company nowadays was something new. Not at all. So here they are, and if you notice how even more broad this becomes, it's not just the cave, it's not just the field. Now what else gets included? Even the trees that are on the border of this place. And you go, well, it makes you wonder, were they fruit trees? Were they nut trees? Who knows? But you realize, you see once again, you see God showing grace to Abraham as he continues to respond out of faith. Now, and once again, this is over 26 miles away from home. And if you're just kind of wondering, from Beersheba up to Mount Moriah is about 44 miles, which is something, because if you think back through Genesis 22, remember they covered that distance in about 3 days. I don't know about you. I don't know if I can walk 14, 15 miles a day for 3 days in a row. But for them, that was part of their life, and apparently they could do it and put great efforts to offer up his sacrifice just to get to Mount Moriah, just to give you an idea. So here they are. You see what's taken place, been deeded over, verse 18. These things were deeded over to Abraham for a possession. Did you catch that? A possession that he purchased. Yet this is the promised land. But the promise was not specifically to Abraham, it was to who? His descendants. And you see, once again, how often we want to think, I have a right to this, this should be mine, God has told me this is mine, and then we back away from faith and love. Look at how Abraham responds. If we start responding to love one another like that, we go, you know what, I am entitled to this, yes, I have a right to this, but I'm going to respond out of faith and love instead, you know what it'll make for? Peace. What a wonderful way to live. Peace among brethren. Now, I know Ephron's not a brother in terms of, in one sense, but in another way he is. Then, notice how it continues. It says, for possession in the presence of the sons of Heth before all who went in at the gate of his city. Notice, is this something just a known transaction between two people? Once again, that picture of the town meeting. Here they all are. Then, verse 19. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field at Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And you go, here she is, buried this great distance away. Then verse 20. So the field and the cave that is in it were deeded over to Abraham for a burial site by the sons of Heth. Isn't it interesting that it goes through all those details just to tell you about where the burial site is? And of course, the real reason behind giving you all this information is, as we go through the rest of the book of Genesis, you're going to notice that not only is Sarah going to be buried here, Abraham is going to be buried here, Jacob's going to be buried here, Isaac's going to be buried here. I think if we get a little bit further, Rebekah's going to be buried here. This is going to turn into a family grave of those of faith. What a way to establish it, right? Nothing roundabout, nothing under the table. Everything is above the board. And you can understand, why is it established? Because it is done in a way that pleases God. And may we be people who are the same. All right. Next week, try to come back. Chapter 24.
To be there, blessed
Communion blend heart with heart.